Our lives directly impact future generations for good and bad. Join us for this important conversation today on Family Vision.
Hi, my name is Ray Rienow. Welcome to Family Vision with my parents, Dr. Rob and Amy Rienow, strengthening families through practical, encouraging, and real conversations.
Rob and Amy Rienow here with Visionary Family Ministries. Welcome to Family Vision. Sweetheart, we have mixed emotions from our kids today. A big snowstorm here in the Chicago area coming down right now as we speak. And of course, whenever that happens, it's, are we going to have a snow day? Are we going to have a snow day? So all the public schools canceled. Wheaton Academy, Christian school canceled.
I heard the entire state canceled with the exception of our homeschool co-op didn't
Our
cancel.
co-school, the Greenhouse co-school, did not cancel.
And so there was much dismay in our house because 2 of our 3 in our home are at the Greenhouse co-school today.
As we speak.
Yes. And so, but all credit to the Greenhouse co-school because it's really not that bad. It's almost shocking that everybody else did
The homeschoolers
cancel.
are a hardy lot.
Yeah, a hardy lot, and the roads aren't that bad, and we're all kind of puzzled why everything shut down, right? I mean, it's not, from a Chicago perspective, this snowstorm is not that crazy.
Not that crazy.
So, all right, it's very confusing. So,
Well, before we dive in today, we're continuing our series in the 10 Commandments, but we wanted to give a special welcome to 3 families that have joined our Visionary Family community. They have become Visionary families. We want to welcome the Koss family in Ohio, the Berkeys in Michigan, and the Wilcoxons in Indiana. This community of families that is coming together from around the world, these visionary families, they all just share the same heart. They want to follow Jesus, and they want to help their kids do the same. It's not perfect families, not families who have it all together, but families that want to link arms and encourage each other in this journey to follow Jesus together. If you want to learn more about becoming a visionary family, go to our website, visionaryfam.com. Right up at the top, you will see the Join the Community button. Click it. Learn all about it. We'd love to build a closer relationship with you. All right, sweetheart, we're continuing a conversation about the 10 Commandments. This is part 2 of commandment number 2.
correct.
From Exodus 20. Let me read it, verses 4 through 6. It says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." So last week we started talking about idol worship, and today we're going to get into the second part of the verse to understand what's going on with this sins of the fathers being visited on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation, and how God shows his love to thousands of generations for those who are faithful to him. But there's some background information that's super important here in the Second Commandment, and it's actually connected to the second giving of the law in Deuteronomy 5.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at the 10 Commandments both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy because they are given again in Deuteronomy 5. And first of all, it's important to understand why that is. This was taught to me in a conference by Carol Joy Seid, who I have a great respect and admiration for. She's a kind of an educational philosophy teacher. But she basically asked us at this conference, why are these commandments given again in Deuteronomy? And at the time, I really wasn't aware. And that's because the commandments are being given again to the children of those who received the first commandments in Exodus. So these people who are receiving these commandments in Deuteronomy 5 were children in Egypt under slavery. They left Egypt with their parents. They saw God's wonders. They saw him working, so the crossing of the Red Sea, but they were children then. And then because of their parents' lack of faith and trust in the Lord for them believing him that they would be able to conquer the cities in the Promised Land, the Lord required that generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So now these children have grown up in the wilderness. They have experienced the manna. They've experienced God's protection in those 40 years, but they also are actually living the consequences of their parents' disobedience, because the Lord made it very clear that none of that generation, those adults in that generation, would be able to go into the promised land because of their lack of faith and trust in the Lord's command to go into the promised land. They didn't really believe that he was going to, they were too afraid to do that. So these children have lived the consequences of their parents' disobedience. And I just think it's really interesting to keep that in mind, because here we have in this commandment this that the visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. So here they are, the first generation, and they are experiencing this consequence. So what's also very interesting when we look at this commandment in Deuteronomy 5 is that goes right into Deuteronomy 6, which I think you'll add more to, but it's very interesting that we don't have the great commandment comes in Deuteronomy 6, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and strength, and to impress these commandments on your heart and to teach them diligently to your children. So it really is in the second time of giving the law that we have the great commandment. And it's almost as if Moses is telling the people, this is so, so important, like that all of these commandments come in this context of how important it is to love him, to walk with him, to trust him, to have these commandments on your heart. They're not just supposed to be something that we read once and forget about. So here we have these things connected in Deuteronomy when we're talking about this second commandment.
And I think every family has experienced this principle. We've got the negative and the positive. When it says that God visits the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, basically it's just talking about how sin spreads in families, how there can be generational bondage in families apart from Christ. And we see this in our modern world. Addiction spreads in families, spreads from one generation to another. Anger spreads in families, one generation to another. I think one of the saddest things, and you and I have had experience walking with people through this, a young person grows up in a home where there's anger and abuse, and they swear to God and themselves, if I'm a parent someday, I would never hurt my child the way I've been hurt. But as we know, statistically, that frequently happens because there's this generational bondage to this anger and abuse or infidelity spreading in families. Favoritism is a sin we see in the patriarchal families in Genesis, generation after generation. And Satan just loves to spread bondage from one generation to the next. It's also tied to the New Testament principle that we reap what we sow. So when one generation sows in this context, right, hatred for God or disobedience, sometimes it's the next generation that reaps the fruit of the disobedience of the parents.
And I think it's important that in this connection with idolatry, there are so many warnings in Scripture and Deuteronomy about the trap of idolatry, that you'll be ensnared, you'll be deceived or tricked into it. And I think that's important that, even in God's people, you may love the Lord and desire to serve him, but there can be this ensnarement or a trap that you're not even realizing that there are idols that are being passed down generationally. I want to go to Deuteronomy 11:16. And again, it connects idolatry with our hearts. It says in Deuteronomy 11:16, beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away from the Lord and serve other gods and worship them. So there's this warning, beware that your hearts are not deceived, because the Lord knows that it's this deception that leads, even if certain parts of our lives, so you still have these idols and others that we're serving in our life. One real practical example that comes from my life is involvement in Freemasonry. Now, I come from a family that has had Freemasonry in its background generationally, and that is one of these things where I think there's an ensnarement as a trick, because what's interesting is that many years ago, like Freemasons, even in the early founding of our country, you would have these Freemason clubs even meeting in churches. Like it wasn't considered necessarily something that was bad or wrong. In fact, what's really interesting is that Charles Finney is famous for calling out Freemasons and getting them out of the churches. That's why we don't see Freemason clubs in churches today, but we see that they're in towns. But that's an example to me. I have reaped negative things from that in my life, from my ancestors being part of Freemasonry, because it is a trick. It's actually at the top of Freemasonry is Lucifer. And you may not know that when you first get into the club, but that's a prime example of that ensnarement. I wanted to read one other passage in Deuteronomy that really talks about how important it is to listen to the Lord and to pay attention to these things. And look how strongly he talks to his people as they're going into the promised land. It says, "Be careful to listen to all these words which I am commanding to you, so that it may be well with you and with your children after you forever, because you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. When the Lord your God cuts off and destroys before you the nations which you are going to dispossess, and you dispossess them and settle in their land, beware that you are not lured and ensnared into following them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods, so that I too may do likewise? You shall not behave this way toward the Lord your God, for they have done for their gods every repulsive thing which the Lord hates. For they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods." And that is one thing I wanted to bring up when we talk about this ensnarement of idolatry, is that one of the biggest pains that will bring into our life is that we will make the wrong sacrifices. And for here, in this extreme example, the Israelites were tricked into thinking that they needed to literally sacrifice their children. But in our day and life, if we have idols in our life, we will also make the sacrifices that we might be sacrificing things that we really don't. Like if money is an idol or success is an idol, you might sacrifice things with your own children or your own family that are important because that is your idol and you're actually serving that. And that is not a good sacrifice to make. And so I'm going to go into this. I go into this so deeply. It's hard for me to keep this concise in a podcast because in the Shine Bible study, we have 2 whole sections on how believing God with our heart involves both identifying idols, the deception behind it, and how we get rid of those in our lives in order to not only have more freedom in our own life, but to bring that freedom to our children and the future generations of our family. And I'm going to be doing this Shine small group experience starting on Wednesday, March 5th. I'm really hoping that women will join me as we dive into that together. So you can get all those details at visionaryfam.com/shine. But that's a much bigger discussion about this concept of idolatry and deception.
Yeah, real quick. So ladies of all ages,
yes,
you want to be a part of this. It's going to be an 8-week experience with Amy. There's you're going to get the book, the prayer journal, the online course, as well as 8 Zoom sessions with this small group. It's not going to be a huge group. It's going to be a small group of women, all ages, to be able to press into these things together and grow in your faith and your identity in Christ. Again, visionaryfam.com/shine. Well, that first section here has this warning, and it's pretty discouraging, right? Yes. Sinful patterns passing in families. But what can we do if we see these patterns in our families or we don't want to see them continue? We've got very, very good news, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead, conquering sin, death, and the devil. And because of the power of the cross, we can experience freedom. He can break the chains of these generational curses. But it doesn't just happen automatically by becoming a Christian. We need to do some spiritual warfare and spiritual battle. One of the patterns that we see in the Old Testament, and I'm specifically thinking here of Jeremiah and Daniel, is Jeremiah and Daniel come to God to confess the sins of the people. they are not confessing personal sins, but they're doing what's called representative repentance. Jeremiah was not an idol worshiper, but he comes to God and says, God, we have worshiped idols. He's representing his people and asking forgiveness for their corporate sins. So that's something that you can do with your family. If you see one of these destructive, sinful patterns in your family, whether you have participated in it or not, you can come to God as a representative of your family. So I'll give you an example from my life. My family background, the generations of my family, there is a lot of divorce, okay, and a lot of divorce without any kind of biblical grounds, too. So Mark and I, my brother, as like the first two Christian men in our family, prayed, went before the Lord, say, God, we as representatives of this family tree with all of this divorce, we want to come and confess that to you. Our family, the generations of our family have been in bondage to divorce, and we want to ask that you'd apply the cross of Christ to my life and Mark's life, that you'd break the curse of divorce, give us lifelong Christian marriages so that we would start a new positive generational legacy for our kids and our grandkids and great-grandkids. And that we believe that God has done that and is in the process now of setting up that the future generations reaping what is now being sown, which is a lifelong commitment to our marriage.
You know, when I think about that divorce, when you think about what would the idol be connected there, and often that's just an idol of self, that, you know, the worshiping my own pleasure, my own happiness, that's the top priority there, which often leads to divorce because people can't envision, their own happiness is the most important thing in their life. Yeah. So, but I want to encourage people as they are diving into this commandment to actually read the book of Deuteronomy with their family. There's so much in that book that reminds us of God's desire to bless his people through his commandments, and how his commandments were always intended to help us avoid some of these horrible pitfalls and evil practices that were surrounding God's people as they were going to the promised land. He was like, you do not want to be like them. And so that can be useful for us today to read and hear God's heart for his people, that, his desire was for them to follow these commandments, to walk in his ways. Over and over it says to listen to his voice, that he wants to bless his people, and he wants his people to trust him and to lean into him, and that when they are afraid and there's the giants that they're seeing in the promised land, that the way to defeat those enemies, the way to defeat even the generational sin patterns that Rob is talking about, is to increase our faith and trust in God and in his word and in his voice, and the facts that he desires this love and blessing. And I like it as many translations say, for 1,000 generations. It just goes to show you that the power of his love and blessing far surpasses the curse. And I think that's such an encouraging thing for us to meditate on, that truth, especially for new believers who might feel so overwhelmed, when they look at their family or they look for what they came from. They think, how do we move forward? How do we escape addiction? How do we escape anger? How do we prevent these things from being continued? And the answer is to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and his word, and to learn to trust him. It's through faith that we defeat the enemies that are against us.
Yeah, you're so right. The contrast in the numbers is so huge. 3 to 4 generations impacted by bondage, 1,000 generations impacted by righteousness. My favorite example of the 1,000-generation promise in the Bible, or the multiple generation promise of blessings, is from 1 Kings chapter 15. It tells us there about King Abijah, who was David's great-grandson. And let me read just a couple of verses here. It says, Abijah walked in all the sins that his father did before him, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his forefather. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So Abijah was not a righteous man, but God brought blessing into his life. Why? Well, one reason: the faith of his great-grandfather David. It's possible that God's brought blessings into your life in response to the righteousness of one of your ancestors. See, God's promising that what we do right here, right now, in our personal relationship with Him, as Amy just said, in our faith in Him, that our obedience and our discipleship of our children is going to have an impact in the lives of our descendants. So we're going to continue next week with commandment number 3, not taking the name of the Lord in vain. But we want to see you in person. This weekend is the Visionary Family Conference in Charleston, South Carolina. The first weekend in March, the Visionary Family Conference will be in Nashville. Then April 12th, the Healing Family Relationship Seminars coming to West Chicago, Illinois. We've got a Visionary Family Conference in Atlanta in May. And then we want to spend a week of family camp with you, July 19 to 25, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Lake Huron, Cedar Bay Family Camp. We would love to spend that time with all the generations of your family. Get info, join us, register, visionaryfam.com, click the events button. And as always, we want to connect with you personally. Maybe you've got a question or a comment about today's episode, or you'd just like to get prayer for your family. You can always email us at podcast@visionaryfam.com. And we look forward to our next time together with you on Family Vision.